In the golden age of Hollywood, one man's wild curls and manic smile lit up movie screens across America. Gene Wilder, the neurotic genius who gave us Willy Wonka, Young Frankenstein, and countless moments of pure comedic magic. But then, at the height of his fame, something changed. The laughter stopped, the cameras turned away, and one of Hollywood's most beloved stars simply disappeared. Tonight, we uncover the heartbreaking truth behind why Gene Wilder vanished from Hollywood forever. A story of love, loss, and a man who chose his heart over his career. Gene Wilder wasn't born to be a star. He was forged by necessity, shaped by trauma, and molded by an unrelenting need to make others laugh. Born Jerome Silberman in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in 1933, his journey to Hollywood royalty began in the most unlikely place, a doctor's office, where his mother lay dying of rheumatic heart disease. Little did the world know that this shy, anxious boy would transform his pain into pure comedic gold. At just 8 years old, Gene made a promise that would define his entire existence. He would never make his mother worry again. He would be the one to bring joy, to chase away the darkness, to turn tears into laughter. This sacred vow would later become both his greatest strength and his most devastating weakness. The young Jerome discovered acting not as an escape, but as a survival mechanism. At the University of Iowa, he studied communication and theater arts, but it was his time at the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School in England that truly awakened the performer within. Here, surrounded by centuries of theatrical tradition, Gene learned that comedy wasn't just about making people laugh. It was about revealing truth through absurdity, about finding light in the deepest shadows. When he returned to America, armed with classical training and an insatiable hunger for authenticity, Gene threw himself into the brutal world of New York theater. He waited tables, taught acting, and performed in countless productions, each role building the foundation of what would become one of cinema's most distinctive voices. His breakthrough came with The Complacent Lover in 1961. But it was his collaboration with a young, unknown playwright named Neil Simon that would change everything. The stage was set for greatness, but nobody, not even Gene himself, could have predicted the meteoric rise that was about to unfold. In those dimly lit theaters of New York, watching audiences lean forward with anticipation, Gene Wilder was learning the most important lesson of his career, the power to heal. Through humor was both a gift and a curse that would follow him for the rest of his days. The year was 1961, and fate had a sense of humor. Gene Wilder, still relatively unknown, was performing in a small off-Broadway production when a wild-haired, fast-talking comedy writer named Mel Brooks wandered into the theater. What happened next was nothing short of magical, too comedic, souls recognizing their perfect match, like lightning finding its conductor. Brooks, already making waves in television with Your Show of Shows, saw something in Gene that others had missed. It wasn't just his obvious talent or his impeccable timing, it was the controlled chaos behind his eyes. The way he could shift from neurotic anxiety to explosive rage in a single heartbeat. This guy, Brooks would later say, could make you laugh and cry in the same sentence. Their first collaboration came in 1967 with The Producers, a film so audacious, so brilliantly insane, that Hollywood executives didn't know whether to greenlight it or have Brooks committed. Gene's portrayal of Leo Bloom, the terrified accountant with secret dreams of Broadway glory, was a masterclass in controlled hysteria. Every twitch, every stammered line, every moment of wide-eyed terror was perfectly calibrated to create comedy gold. But it was behind the scenes where the real magic happened. Brooks and Wilder would spend hours crafting each scene, with Mel encouraging Gene to dig deeper into his neuroses, to find the comedy in his own pain. Make it hurt, Brooks would whisper between takes. The funnier it gets, the more it should hurt. This philosophy would become the cornerstone of Gene's approach to comedy, truth wrapped in absurdity. Pain transformed into laughter. The success of The Producers launched Gene into Hollywood's stratosphere. But more importantly, it taught him that his greatest comedic weapon was his own vulnerability. In a town built on facades and false confidence, Gene Wilder dared to be genuinely, authentically nervous, and audiences couldn't get enough. Little did anyone know, this authenticity would later become both his greatest strength and the very thing that would drive him away from the industry forever. The partnership with Brooks was more than professional. It was a meeting of kindred spirits who understood that comedy was serious business, that laughter was a form of revolution, and that the best jokes came from the darkest places in the human heart. When Roald Dahl's twisted imagination met Gene Wilder's manic brilliance. In 1971, movie history was made, but the story behind Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory reveals a man grappling with fame, artistic integrity, and the terrifying responsibility of shaping children's dreams. Gene didn't just play Willy Wonka, he became him, channeling every ounce of his own childhood wonder and adult disillusionment into a character that was simultaneously magical and menacing. The famous entrance scene, where Wonka limps forward with his cane before performing that gravity-defying somersault, wasn't in the original script. It was Gene's idea. his way of showing that nothing about this character or this story would be what audiences expected. Behind the candy-colored sets and whimsical songs, Gene was fighting a battle that would define the rest of his career. He insisted on certain conditions for taking the role, including significant input into the character's wardrobe and demeanor. The purple velvet jacket, the wild hair, the unpredictable mood swings, every detail was carefully crafted to create a character who was both childlike and ancient, innocent and knowing. What the world didn't see were the late nights Gene spent in his trailer, studying the psychology of genius, of isolation, of a man who had everything but connection. He drew from his own experiences with loneliness, with the pressure of making others happy while struggling with his own demons. Wonka wasn't happy, Gene would later confess in rare interviews. He was just very, very good at pretending to be. The film's mixed critical reception stung more than Gene ever let on. While children adored the movie, many adult critics dismissed it as frivolous fantasy. But Gene knew something they didn't. He had created a character that would outlive them all, a figure so iconic that children would be quoting his lines 50 years later. The weight of that responsibility, of knowing that generations of children would remember him primarily as the candy maker, began to press down on his shoulders like a velvet-covered boulder. In quiet moments between takes, watching the child actors laugh and play, Gene sometimes wondered if he was giving too much of himself away. Each performance, each perfectly timed line delivery, each moment of manufactured magic was a piece of his soul offered up to the world. He was becoming beloved, but at what cost? The chocolate factory was a prison as much as it was a paradise. And Gene Wilder was beginning to understand that fame was its own kind of golden ticket, beautiful, but ultimately hollow. By 1974, Gene Wilder had proven himself as an actor, but young Frankenstein would reveal him as a creative force of nature. What began as a simple idea, a comedic sequel to the classic Universal monster movies, evolved into something approaching artistic perfection, a film that would stand as the pinnacle of Gene's creative collaboration with Mel Brooks. Genesis of the project came during the filming of Blazing Saddles, when Gene approached Mel with the 3-page treatment he'd been nurturing. The concept was audacious. Take the most famous monster story in cinematic history and turn it into a loving parody that was somehow more heartfelt than most serious dramas. Brooks immediately recognized the genius in Gene's vision. This wasn't mockery, it was resurrection through laughter. Gene threw himself into the project with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He co-wrote the screenplay, diving deep into the original James Whale films, studying every camera angle, every shadowy corner, every moment of gothic terror. But where others saw camp, Gene saw opportunity for genuine emotion. His Frederick Frankenstein wasn't just a comedic character, he was a man struggling with legacy, with family shame, with the terrible responsibility of scientific discovery. The filming process revealed Gene at his most collaborative and most demanding. He insisted on shooting in black and white, using the original Universal Studios sets, even employing some of the same laboratory equipment from the 1931 Frankenstein ep. Every detail mattered because every detail was a love letter to the films that had shaped his childhood imagination. Between takes, Gene could be found adjusting lighting, discussing camera angles, perfecting every nuance of his performance. His chemistry with the cast, particularly Marty Feldman, Terry Gare, and Cloris Leachman, created a magical ensemble where every actor seemed to understand instinctively that they were part of something special. Gene's direction of their comedic timing was masterful. He knew exactly when to push for bigger laughs and when to pull back for genuine emotion. The famous putting on the Ritz sequence, where Frederick and his monster performed together, perfectly encapsulated Gene's philosophy of comedy. It was absurd, it was heartwarming, and it was somehow profoundly moving all at once. But success came with shadows. Even as critics hailed Young Frankenstein as a masterpiece and audiences packed theaters worldwide, Gene was beginning to feel the weight of expectation. Every future project would be measured against this achievement, every performance scrutinized for signs of decline. The very perfection of the film became a prison, trapping him in a comedic persona that was increasingly difficult to escape. In 1976, two of comedy's most unlikely partners joined forces for Silver Streak, creating a dynamic that would redefine buddy comedies forever. Gene Wilder, the neurotic white intellectual, and Richard Pryor, the explosive black street comedian, shouldn't have worked together, but their differences became their greatest strength. Their first meeting was electric and awkward in equal measure. Gene, always precisely prepared and methodical in his approach, encountered Richard's improvisational chaos like a controlled explosion meeting a wildfire. Where Gene found humor in anxiety and overthinking, Richard discovered it in raw honesty and social observation. Their comedic styles were so different they seemed to come from different planets, but their mutual respect for each other's craft created an immediate bond. The filming of Silver Streak revealed the depth of their connection. Between takes, they would sit together, Gene listening intently as Richard shared stories from his troubled childhood, his battles with addiction, his experiences with racism in Hollywood. In return, Gene opened up about his own struggles with anxiety, his complicated relationship with fame, and his constant fear of disappointing audiences. They were healing each other through conversation, finding common ground in their shared understanding of pain as the root of all great comedy. Their on-screen chemistry was undeniable, but it was their off-screen friendship that truly mattered. Richard saw past Gene's careful public persona to the worried, sensitive man beneath. Gene recognized in Richard a comedic genius, whose raw talent was matched only by his vulnerability. They began spending hours together, not working on scripts but simply talking about comedy, about life, about the strange burden of making people laugh. When your own heart was often breaking, the success of Silver Streak led to 3 more collaborations, but with each film, Gene watched his friend spiral deeper into personal demons. Richard's drug addiction, his erratic behavior, his increasingly dangerous lifestyle created a constant tension. Gene found himself in the impossible position of trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved, of watching genius destroy itself in real time. Their final collaboration, Another You, in 1991, was heartbreaking to witness. Richard, ravaged by multiple sclerosis and years of substance abuse, could barely remember his lines. Gene, ever the professional, covered for his friend's difficulties while his own heart quietly shattered. He was watching his comedic soulmate fade away, and there was nothing his talent, his success, or his love could do to stop it. This experience would plant the seeds of Gene's eventual disillusionment with Hollywood, a place that consumed its brightest stars and called it entertainment. By the early 1980s, Gene Wilder was trapped in a golden cage of his own making. While audiences adored his comedic performances, his desperate desire for dramatic recognition remained unfulfilled, creating an artistic hunger that would eventually contribute to his withdrawal from Hollywood. The entertainment industry had typecast him so completely that dramatic roles seemed impossible to obtain. Directors, producers, and casting agents couldn't see past the wild curls and manic eyes to the serious actor beneath. But Gene knew what they refused to acknowledge. Comedy required the same emotional depth as drama, often more. Every comedic performance was built on a foundation of genuine feeling, real pain transformed into laughter. Why couldn't the industry see that? His attempts to break free from comedy were met with resistance at every turn. Scripts for dramatic roles would mysteriously become unavailable when his name was mentioned. Producers would politely suggest that perhaps comedy was more his wheelhouse. Even his own representations sometimes seemed reluctant to push for dramatic opportunities, afraid of damaging his lucrative comedic brand. The few dramatic roles he did secure were often in smaller, independent productions that failed to reach wide audiences. His performance in The World's Greatest Lover, which he wrote and directed, showed flashes of dramatic brilliance but was dismissed by critics as a vanity project. Each rejection felt personal, each dismissive review another blow to his artistic ego. Behind closed doors, Gene began to question everything. Was he fooling himself about his dramatic abilities? Had he become so associated with comedy that he'd lost touch with other aspects of his craft? The mirror in his dressing room reflected, not just an actor, but a man beginning to doubt his own artistic worth. The very success that had brought him fame was now preventing him from growing as an artist. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal series of auditions for a serious dramatic role in the mid-1980s. Despite delivering what he considered his best dramatic performance, the role went to another actor. The feedback, delivered through his agent, was devastating in its simplicity. They think he's too funny for drama. 20 years of serious acting study, countless hours of emotional preparation, decades of honing his craft, all dismissed because he'd been too successful at making people laugh. That night, sitting alone in his Malibu home, Gene Wilder began to realize that Hollywood's perception of him might never change. The industry that had made him a star was also the prison that prevented him from becoming the complete artist he knew he could be. This realization would fester quietly for years, contributing to a growing disillusionment that would eventually drive him away from acting altogether.